Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I thought we would dip into the Seedstream app and pick out some of the biggest news stories, because there's a lot happening behind the scenes right now. The races might be coming thick and fast, but actually the storylines bubbling away in the background seem to be even thicker and faster than that. So we'll pick out some of the headlines and expand on some of those a little bit. And whilst we're talking about the Seedstream app, I need to say a big thank you to all of you who registered your interest in potentially investing in the project. I'm happy to say we had a great response and that campaign has now gone live. If you're interested, there will be a link in the description of this video which you can follow and go and get involved. I hope it's going to be a lot of fun and of course very successful. I should just say that as with all of these things, if you're investing anything, there's always a risk you could lose your investment. There's the small print done, but you know that. Go and check out the link if you want to know more, and hopefully we can perhaps be working together on it at some point. Let's get into it then, because there is a lot going on, as I say. I'm going to pick out the first few stories and talk about them in a little bit more depth. The first one is that Williams have announced just today that they have signed George Russell and Nicholas Latifi for 2021. So sticking with their current driver lineup for next year as well makes a whole lot of sense. Latifi has really not had a full proper introduction to the sport yet. He's bringing an awful lot of money to that organisation, to the team, which is valuable to Williams, of course. The signing of George Russell, or the confirming of George Russell, kind of puts the nail in the coffin of him moving on to Mercedes, which I think we all knew. Bottas on the brink of being confirmed there. Hamilton we fully expect to sign again as well, which means that George Russell is confined to the back of the grid again for another season, which is not ideal for him. He wants to start making his progression towards the front, but on the flip side of that, he's still got a seat, which is not the same, not can be said for everybody who wants one in this sport. He needs to make the most of that by continually doing a great job that he's doing right now, continually impressing the team, continually impressing those at Mercedes who are watching him. Of course, he's part of that Mercedes family, and his opportunity, I've no doubt, will come at some point. Lewis Hamilton won't be at Mercedes forever. Neither will Valtteri Bottas, for that matter. So George Russell, presumably one of the next in line for a seat at the top table when that comes along. So there you go, that's the first bit of news that's happening. The next one is that Portimao in Portugal, in the Algarve, great circuit, looks like it's very close now to signing a deal to host a round of the World Championship this year, 2020. Crash.net are reporting that is likely to be announced very soon. And the reason that's quite interesting, first of all, it'd be a great place to host a Grand Prix. I drove that circuit myself last year in the Jaguar iPace. It's an amazing track, up and down, undulation, banked corners. It's got a bit of everything, beautiful scenery. It's awesome. We've been testing there as well in the past too. If you haven't seen that video, by the way, I'll link it up in the corner and pop it in the description too. So hopefully we'll get the spectacle of Formula One cars racing around there, which would be brilliant. But the other reason that teams need clarification on where we're going to be racing is that, apart from a simple logistics perspective, they've all got their power units for the season, which they don't know how long they need to last, how many races each one's going to have to do. At the moment, we know that the current power units will have to do their full cycle, so that's not a big issue right now. But when we get to the next power unit, at the end of 7 races or whatever it is, when they start cycling in number 2, they do need to know how many races it has to achieve, because that determines how far you can push it, how many kilometers you're able to use it at the highest power modes, for example, how much scenario 7 Lando's able to do with his, how much overtake button he can smash on those last laps. They need to know the extent of the calendar to be able to determine a strategy for their power unit. So that's something they're all very keen on. Lots of races being mooted right now, even talk of going back to Vietnam and other places. So there's a lot happening in the background around race calendar, and I expect, and the teams expect, some further announcements very soon. But Portimao in Portugal could well be one of those. Just moving to this weekend at the Hungaroring, a note from Race Control has said that the drivers will have their lap times deleted if they leave the track by passing completely over the red and white curbs at turns 4, 11 and 12 during the weekend. So a little bit like the Austrian Grand Prix, they're setting out their stall now. They're going to come down hard on drivers by deleting lap times if they step over the red and white curbs with all 4 wheels of the car in turns 4, 11 and 12. It's nice to see the race control or race director setting that out at this point. So there's no ambiguity about it. Here's the line, go over it. You're going to get your lap time deleted. So I like to see that. I didn't particularly like in Austria, and it seems similar again here, that it's not the edge of the circuit. It's not the white line, which normally denotes the track limits. It's actually over the curbs, which seems that you're giving the drivers a little bit more leeway than they should be allowed. But there you go. As long as they've got a boundary, if they step over it, they will be penalised. So that is good. Now, the other big story that's bubbling away in the background here is a really interesting one, and in the app here it talks about from the perspective of Sergio Perez's manager, Julian Jacobi, exploring options on Perez for a seat next year. Now all this centres around the fact that there are a lot of rumours now that Sebastian Vettel will be moving to what will be Aston Martin for 2021, and instead of it being Lance Stroll, who would make room and move aside, it's looking more and more likely like it will be Sergio Perez, who you would argue is probably the better of their current two drivers. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? Of course, Lawrence Stroll, his entire reason for getting involved in Formula One in the first place, or one of the biggest drivers behind it, was to get his son a seat at the top table in Formula One, a seat at the very front of the grid. He's working towards that. He's following up on that dream, isn't he? So perhaps from that perspective, unsurprising that it looks like it won't be Lance that moves aside. But Perez is a great driver. You speak to anybody at that team, they rate him incredibly highly. Not just because of his speed, but his car control, his tyre management especially. And that's something they've managed to capitalise on over the years in terms of race strategy. He's got so much experience with that team and with that car. Will Sebastian Vettel, if he does indeed come in, will he be able to step into that car and deliver what Perez can currently deliver? And that, I don't think, is as obvious as it might necessarily sound. Yeah, he's a 4-time world champion. He is a great driver, Sebastian Vettel. From a marketing perspective, as you're rebranding to Aston Martin, the pull of having a 4-time world champion leading that campaign is clear and obvious. I get all of that. But from a racing perspective, I'm not sure it's quite as obvious as that. I mean, hopefully, and if it does happen, hopefully he'll do a great job. But it then moves on to the question of what happens to Perez, because we know for him, he brings in a huge sum of money to whichever team he's racing at. Now, if Racing Point or Lawrence Stroll want to buy him out of that contract, which won't be cheap, by the way, he has a contract for next year, they will have to spend a lot of money getting rid of him. He will also take the money that he brings to the team with him as well. That leaves a huge hole, financial hole, which presumably Stroll and his backers will have to fill. They won't be paying Sebastian Vettel a small sum if indeed he joins. So there's a financial hit, but if they can take that, I understand perhaps some of the reasons for going for it. Perez, though, the story goes on to say that the Mexican media are reporting that Sergio Perez's manager is negotiating with other teams, including Haas and Alfa Romeo. Now, if you think about that, the knock-on effect of that is that the current lineups at both of those teams would have to make way if Perez is coming in with all of his money, which both of those teams could definitely benefit from. If he goes to Alfa Romeo, you'd say that might be the nail in the coffin for Kimi's Formula One career, perhaps. If he goes to Haas, perhaps it could be the end for Grosjean. So these knock-on effects of spilling down all the way from the top of Vettel losing his gig at Ferrari, that cascading all the way down the grid could end up losing the seat of somebody like Grosjean or Kimi Raikkonen. You can have an opinion on whether that's good or bad, and we won't debate that now, but it's amazing how far this whole thing cascades its way down. So that was quite an interesting one as well. I'd love to know your thoughts on Vettel to Aston Martin, by the way. Good move for him, good move for the team. Is it somewhere in between? Do you feel upset for Perez if it is indeed him that moves on? Should it have been Lance Stroll that made way? He's had his shot in Formula One. He hasn't delivered to the very highest level that might be required. Should it be him that's stepping aside with the greater interests of Aston Martin from 2021 and beyond? Should they be ahead of any loyalty to Lawrence Stroll's son? Ongoing debate, I would say. There's some interesting stuff about Hamilton, talking about his first 2 races in Austria and how, whilst he had a much better result at the second race, he found the first race much more enjoyable because he was battling through the field. But he goes on to talk about how his mental battle to overcome that disappointing first weekend, how that played out and how he focused everything to getting himself in the right place and delivering at the top of his game in the second weekend, which clearly he did. That's quite an interesting read too. And let's just show you what's happened to the weather forecast for the Hungarian Grand Prix, because it has changed, and whilst it's always incredibly hot there, it is now looking highly likely that we could get thunderstorms on any of the 3 days or all of the 3 days. Now that is a circuit which is treacherous in the wet. You need to use the curbs to get the fastest lap time. It's a lumpy, bumpy, twisty and cambered circuit. Very difficult when the grip level has dropped because of water. I've done a full track guide, by the way, which I'll also link up there and pop in the description if you haven't seen it yet. Go check that out, where I drive around the lap on the simulator talking about each corner and what's required to get the fastest lap time out of it. But yeah, interesting, we could well have rain. There's also a note from the circuit which talks about the markings around the track, including the track edges, have been painted with non-slip paint to try and minimise the loss of grip. Some notes about guardrails have been realigned in certain corners, and additional debris fencing has been placed around marshal posts for this weekend, just to increase their protection. And finally, that there will be 2 DRS zones like there were last year, but both DRS zones sharing the same activation point. So whereas normally each DRS zone has its own independent activation zone or activation line, here, if you are behind the car in front within 1 second of the car in front, just as you come into the final corner, turn 14, DRS will be activated. You'll be able to use it down the start-finish straight, and even if by that point you get past the car you were chasing and have nobody in front of you by the time you get to the second DRS zone, you've already activated it, so we'll still be able to use it. Sorry, you've already triggered it, so you'll be able to activate it in the second zone as well. Slightly unusual, but that's the way it is, just because of this particular circuit layout. 2 DRS zones, 1 detection point. There we go. Tyre wear is going to be low. Say Pirelli always is particularly low, but that may not come into play if the weather does play its part. 14 corners, mainly slow, so it will start to swing back towards the teams that don't have the power advantage. So the Ferrari powered teams that have been hurting so much in Austria, it may well swing back towards them, where this is a circuit much more about aerodynamic grip and mechanical grip and driver influence. Getting your driver hooked up and in the zone can play a huge part in lap time, much more so than outright maximum power, where all of those Ferrari powered teams are struggling so much right now. There you go. That's it for today. I want to know your thoughts on all of those things. That would be great. Some really interesting talking points. Do you agree on Williams keeping their drivers as they are? What does it mean for George Russell's future? And the big one, what about all of this speculation about Sebastian Vettel's future? Is it the right move for him and the team coming into what will be Aston Martin, and then the knock-on effects of all of that? I want to know your thoughts. Drop me a comment down below, give the video a like, and if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, I'd really appreciate it if you did. Have a great one, folks. Let's hope it's a good weekend. I'll see you soon. Ta-da.